Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 228, Family and the Home. Often when we're looking at things and examining them on this podcast, it can often feel like we feature specific people, and quite often they're reasonably well known, or at least publicly recorded, and we hit on major themes like farming and mining and immigration and colonization and language. But it's pretty rare that we travel down sort of the smaller paths, if you want to call that history smaller paths. And I think that's something that's important as well. It's something we need to touch on, because I think when we look at and evaluate how the world works, it doesn't work in a massive projection. It isn't always about the kings and the armies or the major movers and shakers in the world, or even the writers and the poets or the songs that come out of these people. It's as much about the daily life of normal, everyday people, and their history up until this point is very shakily known, and is, as I once put it on an episode, it's through a glass darkly. You don't really have a good concept of what you're seeing and how to perceive it. And we're starting to get into a situation where people are able to write down their lives to actually give you an insight into the daily lives of people who are not necessarily the big predominant people we think of. We're starting to get into just an average everyday person who's doing their average everyday things. You know, maybe they are farmers, maybe they're ranchers, maybe they're just people who are living their lives as miners, or even the women who support or do their own work, who also are writing about their lives and journaling at a time when this is becoming a much more popular thing to do, and where recording your own history is becoming important to you. As well, we're getting more and more official documentation and bureaucracies which give us another measurement of comparison through legal documents, through court cases, through criminal justice programs, and through mental institutions and hospitals. We're starting to gain a better understanding of what the daily life of most people is like. And so I wanted to focus a little bit in on that, and specifically on the family, because the family becomes a centralized unit during this period. The 1800s becomes a place where you have families moving away from one another. They're not just always existing in one central location. They're not living predominantly in one location their entire lives. There are people that at this point are starting to move around and starting to find experiences in very different locations from where they started, be it in the Americas or South America or India or China. Even later on in this century, there will be people who are now moving into Africa and other places like that are starting to become citizens on a broader perspective, and are in that motion becoming less and less about Wales themselves and more about the new countries they live in. And in all that, there are still families that still remain in Wales, that still are people who are important to cover, who aren't doing the big famous things, or aren't even doing big spectacular things, like taking major risks to travel across oceans in a time period when that could be quite risky, that it could take months sometimes to get to a location. And during that, sickness, illness, and injury can happen, death can happen, and all sorts of things can happen in short order, which can cause your life to end very abruptly. And that can still happen at home, but it's a little different, and the risks and things that are happening are much better understood and well known amongst the population. You know, the mining disasters, unfortunately, are not uncommon. They're not something of a surprise. It's a risk that you take every time you go into a mine in Wales at this time period. You know, the accidents on the farm or accidents for just an average person weren't out of the realms of possibility any more than they are now. It's just the consequence of them could be quite sharp and could be quite horrific for some people. Along with them, you have problems such as, you know, disease and infirmities that are happening to people. So all of these things continue to make life difficult. and will continue to make life difficult for a very long time. And one could argue they still do today. So with all that in mind, I want to focus in on this level a little bit. It's still important that we travel through history to examine, the larger pockets, but it's also important to examine the smaller pockets of history. And it's critical to the understanding of how the Welsh population dealt with change and with struggle and with economics at a 1 foot level, not just some massive overview that gives us a statistical understanding, but one that also gives us an understanding for the everyday person what life was like. In this episode, I want to talk a bit about family life and generally how it existed for people in rural and urban environments, why it was the same and why it was different, of course, and how did this balance itself, and how going forward, I want to get into the discussion of the specifics in future episodes using some of the people that we'll eventually discuss as part of the evidence for the whole of what life was like. The culture of Wales was changing dramatically during this period as well, and with it there was a rising interest in Welsh language books, newspapers, and periodicals to a larger literate audience. In the 1840s and 1850s, we saw the rise of Welsh language periodicals and newspapers such as the I Gladgarwr and the I Goliad. These publications were crucial in keeping the Welsh language alive and fostering a sense of national identity. In these papers, readers could find news and religious content, poetry, and essays on social issues, all in Welsh, something that reaches the majority of the audience at the time. They became platforms for intellectual debate and discussions about the future of Wales in a rapidly changing world. Literature also flourished during this time with poets like Ceiriog Hughes and novelists like Daniel Owens, who contributed to the richness of Welsh culture. Owens's work, through published slightly later, was hugely influenced by the cultural change of the 1840s and 50s. So again, we're talking about these groups, but let's get down to the point. The early 1800s in Wales was a time of tremendous transformation. The Industrial Revolution was, of course, in full swing, pulling people from the countryside to the growing industrial towns in South Wales and in the Northeast. But at the same time, much of Wales remained deeply rural, with farming still at the heart of everyday life for many. So let's dive into what that life was like for Welsh families in this contrasting environment. Life in rural Wales, let's start with that, where the majority of the population lived at the beginning of the century, of course, and for many years to come, to be fair. The landscape was rugged and beautiful. If you've been to Wales, you know this. If you've seen pictures, you would know this as well, but it hasn't changed massively from year to year. And with green valleys and towering mountains and a patchwork of small farms dotted here and there and everywhere, family life here was shaped by the rhythm of the land and the seasons and animals they kept. In these rural areas, farming was the cornerstone of everyday existence. Most families lived in modest cottages with thick stone walls and thatched roofs. I can attest to that because my own family had exactly those kind of buildings in northwest Wales. The Welsh word cynes, meaning warmth or coziness, would describe these homes well. Cottagecore, if you want to use a modern word that I've heard a lot on YouTube, as they were often centered around the hearth and where meals were cooked and family members gathered for warmth and conversation. These buildings are really small, by the way. Like, that's the other thing that sort of surprised me, is how small they are, because most of them had multi-member family. It wasn't just mom, dad, and a kid. It was mom, dad, and maybe 4 to 5 kids. And in some cases, maybe with grandpa and grandma in there. And those kind of situations show you just how different our view of life is versus their view of life, because they can live in a much smaller environment and not feel like it's as oppressive or hard to do, especially on a North American standpoint. I will be honest and say, if you live in Britain, smaller housing is kind of normal, but not this small. This is like a really small, maybe 1 or 2 bedroom place that has a massive amount of people relative to the size of it living in it. So that's something to keep in mind when we're talking about these kind of things. It's not just a case of it being, oh, it's great. No, it could be a little bit claustrophobic, I would argue. And certainly on a North American comparison, it would seem absolutely tiny by comparison to what we're used to. The average family would tend to their own plots of land that they would have, growing vegetables such as potatoes, cabbages, and carrots. Livestock, especially sheep, as we mentioned last episode, were a crucial part of rural life in Wales. Sheep farming had been a tradition for centuries, and the wool was a valuable commodity. Again, something we've talked about. And the family's ability to spin wool and weave fabric was often essential to their economic survival, and women in particular would be heavily involved in this cottage industry. As we talked about in our last episode, this was starting to come to an end in this period because of the takeover of industrial wool factories, which were growing in prominence during this period. The Welsh countryside in the 1800s was a world dominated by agriculture, and women in these rural areas played crucial roles in sustaining both families and communities. Life was hard, labor-intensive, and largely shaped by the seasons. For many women, their lives revolved around the farm, working alongside men in the fields, tending livestock, and managing household duties that were essential to survival, and quite often doing it by themselves or with their children. Women were often seen as the backbone of the family farm, while men might focus on heavier labor like plowing or building, or in some cases doing other jobs around the community, which they would need to do in order to finance some of their ability to survive the winter or the summer. And along with that, women handled, in their case, dairy production, while that was a key part of rural Welsh life. Milking cows, making butter, churning cheese were daily activities. Again, something else I can attest to, because one of my ancestors was well known for their ability to make and produce butter. And amongst a couple of other things that they used to do, they would then take it into the local village and sell it. And so we have information on these kind of things. So that, and that wasn't unfamiliar to most people in this time period. This is nothing new. If you're having to make a go of it on your own, you got to produce pretty much everything. The products women made weren't just for family consumption. They were, of course, sold at local markets, contributing to the family income. In fact, many women were responsible for financial success of these farms, even though men traditionally owned the land and were seen as the runners of this process. But it wasn't just on the farm where women made their mark. They were also vital to the fabric of rural communities, often organizing and participating in local fairs, religious events, and in communal activities. The chapels, a central part of Welsh life in this period, offered women opportunities to engage in community leadership through charity work and organizing religious gatherings. These events were often the only social outlets rural women had, and they were places where they could exercise a degree of influence in a male-dominated society. Education for girls in rural areas was limited. Many young girls had to leave school early to help their families, especially during the busy farming seasons. However, literacy rates in Wales were, as I mentioned before, surprisingly high compared to other parts of Britain, and thanks to the influences of Sunday schools connected to the chapels. And we've talked about this in the past as well, about the fact that especially the Welsh language Sunday schools did not separate the boys and the girls, who actually were taught together, which was something that didn't happen in the Anglican schools, where there was a separation and where there was a definite split in what the kids were taught at this time period. And of course, the Anglican schools were generally teaching English, whereas most of the non-denominational schools or the other types of religious schools were teaching Welsh predominantly. These schools taught boys and girls to read, primarily for religious purposes. Again, we've mentioned this before. And it also meant that women in rural Wales were more literate than their counterparts in some other parts of the UK. Children in rural Wales had a role to play from a very young age. Education was not universally available yet for many, so many children would help out on the farm, tending to animals, gathering firewood, or helping their parents with crops. It wasn't uncommon for children to walk several miles each day to fetch water from a nearby stream or well, which it might seem like a hard life by modern standards. This work was seen as part of the family collective effort to survive and thrive. There was, however, more than just work. Religion and community were central to Welsh rural life. Sunday was a day for chapel, where families would gather for worship. Nonconformist chapels were particularly influential during this period, reflecting the strong Methodist revival that had swept through Wales in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These chapels were not just places of worship, but also social hubs where families could meet and socialize. However, rural life was not without its challenges. Isolation was a reality for many families living in remote areas. Medical care, as I mentioned, was limited, and when illness struck, families largely relied on home remedies and local wise women who practiced traditional healing methods. But despite these difficulties, many families maintained strong sense of resilience and solidarity and connections to their land and community. The Welsh language, which was spoken in most rural homes, was an integral part of that identity, reinforcing cultural ties that would help rural communities maintain their unique way of life, even as the world around them began to change. Now, if we switch and shift our focus to urban Wales, we'll find that they're in some ways very different, and a very unique way of life was emerging. The early 19th century saw the rise of coal, iron, and slate industries, particularly in South Wales. This period of industrial growth led to swift migration of people from the countryside to the industrial towns like Merthyr Tydfil and Swansea and Cardiff. Life in the growing towns was dramatically different from the quiet rural landscapes of the Welsh countryside. For many families, the move to the urban area was driven by the need for work. The promise of better wages drew people to the coal mines, ironworks, and slate quarries, but the reality of urban life was often harsh. In industrial towns, families typically lived in crowded, poorly constructed housing. Workers' cottages were often built quickly and without proper sanitation or ventilation. Diseases like cholera and typhoid were common, and infant mortality rates were high. In contrast to the warmth and coziness of the rural cottages, these urban homes were often cramped and damp, with entire families living in single rooms. Men worked long hours in dangerous conditions, particularly in the coal mines. The Industrial Revolution had brought great wealth to the owners of the mines and the factories, but the workers and their families saw little of this prosperity, thus some of the reasons why we've seen conflict between the two. Pay was low and work was grueling. Many children, even as young as 8 or 9 years old, worked alongside their parents in the mines or factories. And this would carry on for many, many years to come through the 1800s. Legislation would not necessarily alleviate some of these issues. They would carry heavy loads of coal or work in confined spaces underground in which they could fit in that adults couldn't, and this was a far cry from the more communal and family-centric labor of rural life. Women in urban Wales also worked, often as domestic servants or in small-scale manufacturing industries like textile mills. But whether working in the home or outside, women played a crucial role in keeping the household running. They were, as they were in farm homes, responsible for cooking, cleaning, and caring for children, often under extremely challenging circumstances. With industrialization came new opportunities, but also new challenges. Many women found employment in factories, especially in textile mills, as we mentioned, where they worked long hours and often in dangerous conditions. These jobs were exhausting and poorly paid, but for many working-class women, they provided a level of financial independence that they hadn't seen before. In addition to factory work, domestic service was another common occupation for urban women. Many young women from rural areas moved into the cities working as maids, cooks, and nannies in wealthier households. While domestic work didn't offer as much freedom, it was often seen as a more stable and respectable work than factory jobs. Industrial cities were harsh environments, particularly for women. Living conditions in working-class neighborhoods were often cramped and unsanitary, and diseases like cholera and typhoid, as we said earlier, were common. And women, as caregivers, were often on the front lines of managing illness within their families. Despite these challenges, women in urban Wales formed tight-knit communities, providing mutual support through informal networks. They organized around chapels, workers' movements, and charities, which helped create a sense of solidarity. But women were not just passive victims of industrialization. They played an active role in labor movements, especially in the 1830s and 1840s, where strikes and protests swept through the Welsh industrial towns. In some cases, women led the protests against the poor working conditions and low wages. These women, often overlooked in the male-dominated history of the labor movement, were critical to the success of the strikes and community actions. Despite these difficulties, urban families in Wales found ways to build communities and support each other. Nonconformist chapels, just as in rural Wales, played an important role in providing a sense of belonging and spiritual guidance. In fact, the chapels in the industrial towns were often even more vibrant and politically active, as they became centers for social justice and reform. Preachers spoke out against the harsh working conditions and poverty that had plagued the lives of so many working-class families. The Welsh language, while still spoken in many homes, began to decline, however, in urban areas as English became more dominant in industry and public life. However, Welsh culture found new expression in their industrial towns. The Eisteddfod, or festivals of literature and music, became an important part of urban life, helping to keep the Welsh literary and musical traditions alive. As we reflect on the family life in Wales during this period, it's clear that both rural and urban families faced significant changes and challenges, but they responded in different ways, shaped by their environment and the broader societal changes around them. In rural Wales, families were anchored by the land, the chapel, and the local community. Work was hard, but it was often communal and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. Family members relied on each other for survival, and there was a strong sense of continuity with the past because of this. In urban Wales, families were thrust into a rapidly changing world. The Industrial Revolution disrupted traditional ways of life, forcing families to adapt to a new economic reality. Working became more regimented and dangerous, and families often faced extreme poverty and overcrowding. But urban life also created new opportunities for solidarity, political activism, and cultural expression. The chapels, which had long been the centers of spiritual life, became rallying points for working-class families seeking to improve their living and working conditions. One important element of family life that persisted both in rural and urban environments was the role of children. In both settings, children were seen as contributors to the household. While their experience varied, rural children worked on farms while urban children labored in mines and factories, in, I would argue, much more dangerous environments. Their involvement in work was a crucial part of family survival, and this was at a time before children and childhood were seen as a period of innocence and education. Children were a part of the economic unit of the family from a young age. Education itself was changing during this period. With the rise of Sunday schools and the larger education movement, the push for public education in the latter century drove a great change in how children were treated and what was expected of them. In both rural and urban Wales, Sunday schools provided children basic literacy, often in the Welsh language, which helped preserve the culture amidst the waves of industrialization and change. So, family life in Wales during the first half of the 19th century was one of resilience, adaptation, and community. Whether living in remote hillsides of rural Wales or the smoky industrial towns, families found a way to survive and support each other through these profound changes and challenges of this era. And what we'll see is this continued migration into the urban centers will have an effect on Welsh language. And we will see a slow degrading of Welsh as the language of the majority into the language of the minority because of this. If you look even today, the stronger areas even now for the Welsh language remain the rural parts of Wales. It is not the urban centers of the southeast or the northeast. It is more frequently used in the northwest and central and southwest parts of this country. Because of this, we have different perspectives on it, and even as it's revitalized to a degree over the years, there's still always this challenge to that, and I think that's something that will continue to grow and was officially started to happen to the common people more and more because of the movement into the cities. So while yes, families had a similar existence in some respects, they were very, very different in others, and the pressures on them were different in their own way. Yes, diseases were similar, but other aspects of daily life were very different, and expectations were very different on families, and the demands of those were, in a large degree, very fundamental to the way the family changes over the years after this. Now, with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. or watching this episode. I hope you had a wonderful day. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com or on Twitter or now on Blue Sky, if you prefer that, at the Welsh History Pod. And you can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And of course, if you would like to help with financing some aspects of this podcast, you can do so via Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. Very appreciated. Not necessary, but very appreciated, as it does help with the research that I do. Thank you all once again, and we'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.